a battalion of First World War soldiers fighting on the Somme who accidentally, by one means or another, get transplanted to another planet and then have to survive with what they bring with them and what section of trenches they arrive with them as well. So it's science fiction, scientific romance, science pulp. So the piece I want to read is from the second book, The Ironclad Prophecy, which is due out next month. By this stage, the soldiers have been on the planet for 3 months. They've encountered a variety of hostile planets and forms. It's a hell planet, basically, where every ecological niche has been filled and sort of fiercely defended. And they've been betrayed to the dominance of insect species by one of their own, who's then fled. And they believe he's the only one who can find the way back home. So one of the plot threads is the search for Jeffries. So this chapter starts introducing the tank crew, which we met briefly in the first one, but feature heavily in this one. Without trying to be too spoilery, I've picked this particular section. The canyon hadn't been carved by turbulent river waters. It was a brutal crack, a rift torn suddenly in the skin of this world by some groundquake that sundered the land in ages past. The walls rose vertically for almost hundreds of feet, and only in the heat of day the alien sun penetrated the bottommost depths, where great blocks of stone lay strewn where they fell. The only scraps of vegetation to be seen were large patches of blue-green matter scattered over the rock face like lichen, and formed with small blisters of varying sizes that seemed to pulse in direct sunlight as if breathing. The ones in shadow remained inert. The rocks were pockmarked with shallow circular depressions where acid from long vanished blooms had eaten into the surface. An unremitting rumble filled the rock-strewn canyon, echoing off the walls like some imminent but never delivered avalanche, as His Majesty's landship Ivanhoe crawled along, pitilessly shattering into dust small rocks caught under its tracks. Grey smoke billowed from the roof exhaust to be snatched up by the breeze and dispersed behind it as the armoured behemoth crept and clanked through the rocky terrain as if sniffing out a trail. Not that the crew could see much from inside, where the heat and fumes were a microcosm of hell. Progress was slow. With no suspension, the tank had reduced its speed to a crawl, not wanting to belly or throw a track. The machine gunners, Norman and Cecil, squinted through the machine gun loopholes for threats as the rocky walls, partially obscured by dust thrown up from the tracks, rolled by with mesmerising slowness without incident or interest, apart from the blue-green pulsating growths. Cecil took a brief shot at them with his Hotchkiss to see if they'd burst. The rattle of machine gun fire reverberated through the canyon, causing Lieutenant Mathers to turn in his seat and glare at him. It also earned him a clip round the back of the head from Jack Tanner, the ex-prize-fighting gunner, and it smacked his forehead into the handles of the gun barrel. "Quit that, you dozy mare, you're wasting ammunition," he bellowed above the engine's roar. For the moment, they were riding with hatches open to try and cool the interior. At least without the Hun firing machine guns at them, there was no need to wear the stifling splash masks and bruise helmets, and in the baking heat of the great iron oven, most of them had unbuttoned their coveralls that they wore over their trousers, puttees and flannel shirts or their service dress, and had undone their shirts too. At the back of the compartment, by the starboard secondary gears, Alfie wiped the sweat from his forehead as they tried to keep his focus on the back of the driver's chair, from where, every now and again, hand signals for gear changes would come. When he wasn't doing that, he was putting grease on the gears every 30 minutes or so. He caught a glimpse of a small love heart on the engine casing in front of him, drawn by Nellie Abbott's oily finger. He smiled. That was one thing he hadn't bargained on, one of many, this bleeding planet being one of them. But Nellie, what a find she was. She was different. He remembered the first time he met her here on this world. They'd been celebrating their first fresh food, and the Fusilier's commander, Captain Grantham, God rest his soul, had given permission for a bit of a bash. The tank crew hadn't really socialised with the Fusiliers since they found themselves on this world. They were trained to act as an independent unit, and that was the way they liked it. It was part of the attraction of the machine gun corps. They bivvied beside the Ivanhoe. They rarely left its sight. But that night, he'd gone for a walk amongst the campfires. A couple of rowdy bloody infantry had tried to engage him in conversation, but on hearing his accent, they began to jeer and josh him. So he'd wandered off and took a piss over the parapet into one of their trenches. Cocky northern bastards. He was on his way back to the tank when he was accosted by a young girl in a long brown skirt and jacket, who took his arm, linking hers through his, and talked as if they were old friends. "God blimey, what a night! I just got the old Evo from my mate. She's over there talking to that NCO with a crutch. Well, I can tell I'm not wanted. Mind you, she needs a bit of perking up, bless her heart. Then I saw you in your coveralls, and I thought, aye, you're from the tank, ain't you? I ain't never seen one up real close. Don't they look funny, like a huge great iron slug? What kind of engine has she got? I bet she's a beaut. Can I see it?" You could tell from her accent that she wasn't a northerner. But Lord almighty, she never stopped talking. And he let her talk, because she spoke of gears and pistons and carburettors. And quite frankly, he'd never met a girl like her. He'd come all this way from one world to another, and there she was, large as life and twice as brassy, Nellie Bleeding Abbott. And he shook his head in wonder. She'd spent time in the fannies driving ambulances and knew how to strip an engine, had to. No bugger else to do it for half the time. She'd ridden a motorcycle once or twice. They talked of the country rides they might take together if they got back. She wouldn't have it. Not in the sidecar, at any rate. Oh no, not her. She wanted a motorcycle of her own. That was when he fell in love with her, right there. Alfie's face split into an involuntary grin at the memory. The rest of the crew were wary of her. They were used to their secrets in their own company. They didn't welcome outsiders. They wouldn't let her in the tank, crew only, they said. But he snuck her in anyway. Once he'd had to shut her out of one sponsing door as Jack squeezed in the other. The crew had been despondent at the time. It looked like their fuel would run out, and without petrol the tank was just so much scrap. Without the tank, they would be transferred into the battalion to be bought bloody infantry again. But then one of the Tommies had brewed some evil alcoholic concoction that killed a couple of men daft enough to drink it. Unfit for human consumption, they said. But it gave them a new fuel. It ran a little better than the petrol they were used to, but then that was nearly all floppy inferior stuff anyway. This new stuff had been distilled from what they now called petrol fruit. They were back in the game. That was when everything changed. They'd been breathing the fumes for a week or so before they noticed. At first they felt keener, their senses seemed more acute. Colours were brighter, crisper, sounds were clearer, and smells sharper and more distinct. "It's the clean air here," Reggie informed them. "Clears out the tubes," he said, thumping his chest. But he couldn't have been more wrong. Even Lieutenant Mothers seemed to relax. Before he'd been a bundle of nerves in the tank, he was on the verge of funking it. Well, now he seemed to relish driving it. Then again, they all did. Mind you, it helped when you're not being constantly shelled by Fritz artillery or hammered with machine gun fire. It was quite like the old days driving around Elvedon as if it were a fairground ride. The days when they weren't in it were fraught with tension and short tempers. And even the engine, after some initial troubles, seemed to run smoother. It was the fuel itself. They'd heard stories of how the Tommy could have drunk it, saw things, hallucinated. But they weren't drinking it. They didn't have to. Fumes from the engine filled the small, confined space. Ordinary petrol fumes would give tankers carbon monoxide poisoning. They'd end up with vicious headaches, convulsions, and in extreme cases, delirium and psychosis. They'd stagger from tanks and vomit. The petrol vapour would sting their skin and give them itching rashes and in the tiger. This new fuel had different side effects. Once they discovered them, they vowed amongst themselves to keep it quiet. It gave them a sense of euphoria, and under its influence, they began to see the bright little whirls and eddies of indigo as the vapour swirled lazily about the cabin. The white painted iron plates surrounding them throbbed green with the vibration of the engine. Alfie found he could soon identify the state of the engine by the colour it gave off. But most of all, he liked looking at Nellie. Great gaseous expanses of soft yellows billowed gently from her like silk sheets in the wind. And oh, how she shone! If only you could tell her how beautiful she was. She thought herself rather plain, but he doubted anybody had ever seen her the way he had. He recalled the last time he saw Nellie, a day ago now, just before they left. It seemed an age away. They'd received orders to move out on another seeking fine patrol mission. He'd spent half the night checking and tuning the engine, oiling it, having to use rendered down fats as grease. The rest of Ivanhoe's crew were full of pep and up for it. knowing they'd be able to partake of the intoxicating fumes again. The only other person who might have an inkling of the effects was Tulliver, the RFC chap. He used the same petrol fruit liquor to fuel his aeroplane, but he wasn't confined in a dark airless cabin with it. The wind would soon whip away any fumes he might inhale. As the others stocked up on supplies, carefully watched by Company Quartermaster Sergeant Slack, Alfie had wandered off to say goodbye to Nellie. He found her trying to boil a large pan of some edible, stew for want of a better word. "Alfie, can't give us a hand, can you, my duck?" "Sorry, Nellie, moving out. Another of the infantry's exploring patrol missions." "Oh, aye, and keep an eye out for Jeffries," he said. They laughed together. He peered into the pot. "God, whatever the mongol's come up this time, it looks disgusting." "Yeah, well, it isn't for you. It's for them poor beggars in the birdcage," she said, nodding her head towards the barbed wire enclosure where the shell-shocked men like ours. Lieutenant Mathers climbed the steps out of the communications trench that led to the battalion HQ. His shoulders hunched, and a sullen look on his gaunt, pasty face. "Perkins, don't dally, we've got to shove off." He sniffed the air and honed in on the cauldron. What's that?" He reached in, pulled out a lump of something, put it in his mouth, and chewed experimentally. "Oi!" Nellie slapped his hand. "This is for the poor shell-shock victims, not for the likes of you, sir." The rebuke caught Mathers off guard. He looked towards the enclosure at the shuffling, jerking scraps of manhood within, and at least got the manners to look guilty. He coughed in embarrassment. "Yes, right." He wagged the rest of the handful at her. "Still, not bad," he said, and strode away. "Come on, Perkins, work to do." Alfie shrugged an apology. "Moustache," and he followed his commanding officer. The last he saw of Nellie was her lugging the pan towards the birdcage. Bright green ripples burst from through the compartment as the tank lurched. Alfie cracked his head on the overhead pipe. "Watch where you're driving," Alfie bellowed at Ollie's back. "Plenty of room at the bloody top if you're not bleeding happy with it," Ollie retorted. "That Lieutenant Everson's got a real bee in his bonnet about that bounder Jeffries, hasn't he?" Norman was yelling above the noise of the engine. "I mean, this is the 5th time he's sent it on patrol to try and pick up his trail. And have we, Billio? Not a sign. One of the promising directions picked out by Tulliver? Bollocks. But everything looks promising from 1,000 feet up. Oh, and here's a map what a nurse drew. Sorry it's mostly blank, but you chaps mind filling in the blankets as you go?" "We could run right over Jeffries and Ivo and not even notice," Cecil yelled back. Norman nodded in agreement. "Wild goose chase is what it is. Waste of time." "Not at all, dear chap," Reggie chipped in. "Travel broadens the mind, you know. In a place like this, hell's backyard, loosens the bowels more like. Thank God I've got armour plating between me and it is all I can say. Well, I'm all for these little trips of Everson's. Very nice of him. I don't care if we never find this Jeffries," said Reggie. Frank spat in the gangway. "Jeffries my arse." "Frank, please." "Yeah, mind your language," scolded Norman. "Has Reggie taught you nothing?" "Yeah, I hold my pinky up now when I use my canteen," Frank said, demonstrating to wild laughter. "Besides, if he ain't got a boojum like us, then frankly Jeffries is probably dead meat. Why else do you think they sent us out here? Because every other bugger gets eaten, that's why." "Just makes us tin bully beef," said Norman with a grin. "Frankly, I don't care if we never find the bleeder either. We don't need the blights and looking at the sweet deal we've got going here." "Well, I don't feel too happy about that," Alfie shouted across the engine. "It doesn't seem right somehow. Doesn't it bother the rest of you? Maybe we should discuss it again, that's all I'm saying." Frank reached out, grabbed Alfie's coveralls and pulled them towards him under the starting handle. "And all I'm saying, Alfie, is you need to back off a little, mate. We're getting fed up with you and your holier-than-thou attitude. It was a sub's idea. If our plans make you breezy, why don't you just do one and take up your long-haired chum back with the mudsloggers?" "Why? Because we're tankers. Maybe I'm not so crazy about the idea, but I took a bullet for any single one of you. You know that, right? Do we, Alfie? Do we? We don't even know if we can trust you." Frank thrust Alfie away from him with a snort of derision as the others looked on. Alfie shook his head in despair. The devotion to Mathers, who had seen them through, who had kept them supplied with the petrol fruit, who had kept them safe and alive inside their shell of iron, was slipping into fanatical and tinged with paranoia. Even Mathers' moods seemed to fluctuate between insanity and lucidity. Their world had shrunk, and they no longer noticed nor cared. But his world had been expanded. He saw beyond the horizons of armoured plates and rivets. His world was illuminated by Nellie, a moon whose tidal influence was pulling him slowly from their orbit.